As the day was pleasant, Madame Valmont drove over to L'Abri to see Desiree and the baby. It made her laugh to think of Desiree with a baby. Why, it seemed but yesterday that Desiree was little more than a baby herself.
Desiree had been sent to her by a beneficent Providence to be the child of her affection, seeing that she was without child of the flesh. For the girl grew to be beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, the idol of Valmont.
It was no wonder, when she stood one day against the stone pillar in whose shadow she had lain asleep, 18 years before, that Armand Aubigny, riding by and seeing her there, had fallen in love with her. The wonder was that he had not loved her before, for he had known her since his father brought him home from Paris, a boy of 8, after his mother died there. The passion that awoke in him that day, when he saw her at the gate, swept along like an avalanche, or like a prairie fire, or like anything that drives headlong over all obstacles.
Monsieur Valmont grew practical and wanted things well considered. That is, the girl's obscure origin.
Armand looked into her eyes and did not care. He was reminded that she was nameless. What did it matter about a name when he could give her one of the oldest and proudest in Louisiana?
He ordered the corbeille from Paris and contained himself with what patience he could until it arrived. Then they were married.
Madame Valmont had not seen Desiree and the baby for 4 weeks. When she reached L'Abri, she shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did.
It was a sad-looking place, which for many years had not known the gentle presence of a mistress. Old Monsieur Aubigny having married and buried his wife in France, and she having loved her own land too well ever to leave it.
The roof came down, steep and black like a cow, reaching out beyond the wide galleries that encircled the yellow, stuccoed house. Big, solemn oaks grew close to it, and their thick-leaved, far-reaching branches shadowed it like a pall.
Young Aubigny's rule was a strict one, too, and under it his Negroes have forgotten how to be gay, as they had been during the old master's easygoing and indulgent lifetime.
The young mother was recovering slowly, and lay full length in her soft white muslins and laces upon a couch. The baby was beside her upon her arm, where he had fallen asleep at her breast. The nursewoman sat beside a window fanning herself.
Madame Valmont bent her portly figure over Desiree and kissed her, holding her an instant tenderly in her arms. Then she turned to the child. "This is not the baby."
I knew you'd be astonished at the way he has grown. The little conchon de lait. Look at his legs, Mama, and his hands and fingernails. Real fingernails. Zandrine had to cut them this morning. Isn't it true, Zandrine?
The woman bowed her turbaned head majestically. Merci, madame.
And the way he cries is deafening. Armand heard him the other day as far as Leblanche's cabin.
Madame Valmont had never removed her eyes from the child. She lifted it and walked with it over to the window that was lightest. She scanned the baby narrowly, then looked as searchingly at Zandrine, whose face was turned to gaze across the fields.
Yes, the child has grown, has changed. What does Armand say?
Desiree's face became suffused with a glow that was happiness itself.
Oh, Armand is the proudest father in the parish. I believe chiefly because it is a boy to bear his name, though he says not that he would have loved a girl as well. But I know it isn't true. I know he says that to please me. And, Mama, he hasn't punished one of them. Not one of them since baby is born. Even Negrion, who pretended to have burnt his leg that he might rest from work, he only laughed and said Negrion was a great scamp. Oh, Mama, I'm so happy it frightened me.
What Desiree said was true. Marriage, and later the birth of his son, had softened Armand Aubigny's imperious and exacting nature greatly. This was what made the gentle Desiree so happy, for she loved him desperately. When he frowned, she trembled, but loved him. When he smiled, she asked no greater blessing of God. But Armand's dark, handsome face had not often been disfigured by frowns since the day he fell in love with her.
When the baby was about 3 months old, Desiree awoke one day to the conviction that there was something in the air menacing her peace. It was at first too subtle to grasp. It had only been a disquieting suggestion. An air of mystery among the blacks, unexpected visits from far-off neighbors who could hardly account for their coming.
Then a strange, an awful change in her husband's manner, which she dared not ask him to explain. When he spoke to her, it was with averted eyes, from which the old love light seemed to have gone out. He absented himself from home, and when there, avoided her presence and that of her child, without excuse. And the very spirit of Satan seemed suddenly to take hold of him in his dealings with the slaves. Desiree was miserable enough to die.
She sat in her room, one hot afternoon in her peignoir, listlessly drawing through her fingers the strands of her long, silky brown hair that hung about her shoulders. The baby, half naked, lay asleep upon her own great mahogany bed. One of Leblanche's little quadroon boys, half naked too, stood fanning the child slowly with a fan of peacock feathers.
Desiree's eyes had been fixed absently and sadly upon the baby, while she was striving to penetrate the threatening mist that she felt closing about her. She looked from her child to the boy who stood beside him, and back again, over and over. The blood turned like ice in her veins, and a clammy moisture gathered upon her face.
She tried to speak to the little quadroon boy, but no sound would come, at first. When he heard his name uttered, he looked up, and his mistress was pointing to the door. He laid aside the great soft fan and obediently stole away, over the polished floor on his bare tiptoes.
She stayed motionless, with gaze riveted upon her child, and her face the picture of fright. Presently, her husband entered the room, and without noticing her, went to a table and began to search among some papers which covered it.
Armand!
She called to him, in a voice which must have stabbed him, if he was human.
But he did not notice.
Armand!
She said again. Then she rose and tottered towards him.
Armand! Look at our child! What does it mean? Tell me what it means.
It means that the child is not white. It means that you are not white.
It is a lie. It is not true. I am white. Look at my hair. It is brown. And my eyes are gray. Armand, you know they are gray. And my skin is fair. Look at my hand. Whiter than yours, Armand.
As white as Leblanche's.
He returned cruelly, and went away, leaving her alone with her child.
When she could hold a pen in her hand, she sent a despairing letter to Madame Valmont.
My mother, they tell me I am not white. Armand has told me I'm not white. For God's sakes, tell them it is not true. You must know it is not true. I shall die. I must die. I cannot be so unhappy and live.
The answer that came was as brief.
My own Desiree, come home to Valmont. Back to your mother who loves you. Come with your child.
When the letter reached Desiree, she went with it to her husband's study and laid it upon the desk before which he sat. She was like a stone image, silent, white, motionless after she placed it there. In silence, he ran his cold eyes over the written words. He said nothing.
Shall I go, Armand?
Yes, go.
Do you want me to go?
Yes, I want you to go.
He thought Almighty God had dealt cruelly and unjustly with him, and felt, somehow, that he was paying him back in kind when he stabbed us into his wife's soul. Moreover, he no longer loved her, because of the unconscious injury she had brought upon his home and his name.
She turned away like one stunned by a blow and walked slowly towards the door, hoping he would call her back.
Goodbye, Armand.
He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate.
Desiree went in search of her child. She took the little one from the nurse's arms with no word of explanation and, descending the steps, walked away under the live oak branches. She disappeared among the reeds and willows that grew thick along the banks of the deep, sluggish bayou, and she did not come back again.
Some weeks later, in the center of the smoothly swept backyard, was a great bonfire at La Abri. Armand Aubigny sat in the wide hallway that commanded a view of the spectacle, and it was he who dealt out to a half-dozen Negroes the material which kept his fire ablaze.
Laid upon the pyre were silk gowns and velvet and satin ones added to these. Laces, too, and embroideries. bonnets and gloves, for the corbel had been of rare quality.
The last thing to go was a tiny bundle of letters, innocent little scribblings that Desiree had sent to him during the days of their espousal.
There was the remnant of one back in the drawer from which he took them, but it was not Desiree's. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessing of her husband's love.
But, above all, night and day, I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery.
It's winter and everything is dead. My hope, our love. I loved you so, but you told me to go. Leave, you said. I don't know what's become of you. You seem to have lost your head. I am nothing but a fool. For you, I'd do it all over. It's spring, I am alive. I don't know how, but baby boy helps the days pass on by. Everything is new again. It's just now warm enough to open up the windows. It's just now good. The air, crisp. Flowers blooming. It's summer, hot, and sweat sticks to my back. He's getting bigger, and he giggles all the time. He looks like you. It's fall. The leaves change color, and while everything is dying, I've never felt more alive.
Desiree, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Desiree? You in there? Well, it's about earlier. Well, you know us men, right? We never really know how to handle our emotions. You know, right? Desiree, what I said earlier about leaving, I didn't mean that. You know that, right? I wouldn't want you leaving the house. That would just be catastrophic, really. Desiree, you must understand the predicament I'm in. This child, although in pure... I'm sorry. The world is complicated. You must understand that, Desiree. You must understand the predicament I'm in. The questions you were asking, they're questions I'm not really suited to answer. They're complicated. Desiree, they're going to eat this child alive. You know it. I know it. We all know it. You must understand that, Desiree. You do understand that, right? This silence is so peculiar. You must be feeding the baby. Child, why are you not crying? Is anyone in there? Please, for God's sakes, answer me. Desiree, I wouldn't want you leaving the house. That would be catastrophic. But the way you looked back at me while you were leaving, it looked otherworldly. It almost made me feel like I'm not a monster, am I? Armand the monster. Desiree!
Times of sorrow, times of hurt. A helping hand out of the dirt. A special crown in heaven for that child. We see now such trouble was mild. A message true rings. This group tells tales and praise sings. A new purpose, a new message, a new life to these tales of not so ancient strife. Revived anew and presented to you these stories, these echoes, without further ado.
It was cold that day. The great sharp north wind swept out Elysian Field Street in blasts that made men shiver, and bent everything in their track. The skies hung lowering and gloomy. The usually quiet street was more than deserted. It was dismal.
Zadieyh leaned against one of the brown freight cars for protection against the shrill norther, and warmed his little chapped hands at a blaze of chips and dry grass. Maybe it'll snow. Then won't I have fun? Oh, but the wind blows.
It was Saturday, or Zadieyh would have been in school. The big yellow school on Marigny Street, where he went every day when the bell boomed 9 o'clock, went with a run and a joyous whoop, ostensibly to imbibe knowledge. Really to make his teacher's life a burden.
Idle, lazy, dirty, troublesome boy, she called him to herself, as day by day wore on, and Zadieyh improved not, but let his whole class pass him on its way to a higher grade. A practical joke he relished infinitely more than a practical problem. Moreover, he was always hungry and would eat in school before the 10:30 recess, thereby losing much good playtime for his voracious appetite.
But there was nothing in natural history that Zadieyh did not know.
He could dissect a butterfly or a mosquito hawk and describe their parts as accurately as a spectacled student with a scalpel and microscope could talk about a cadaver. The entire 3rd District, with its swamps and canals and commons and railroad sections, and its wondrous, crooked, tortuous streets, was an open book to Zadieyh. There was not a nook or corner that he did not know or could not tell of. He knew just exactly when it was time for crawfish to be plentiful down in the Claiborne and Marigny canals, just when a poor, breadless fellow might get a job in the big boneyard and fertilizing factory, out on the railroad track. And as for the levee, with its ships and schooners and sailors, how he could revel in them.
Zadieyh shivered as the wind swept around the freight cars. There isn't much warmth in a bit of a jersey coat.
Wish 'twas summer. Don't believe I like snow. It's too wet and cold.
And with a last parting caress at the little fire he had builded for a minute's warmth, he plunged his hands in his pockets, shut his teeth, and started manfully on his mission out the railroad track towards the swamps.
It was late when Zadieyh came home, to such a home as it was, and he had but illy performed his errand. So his mother beat him and sent him to bed supperless. A sharp strap stings in cold weather, and a long walk in the teeth of a biting wind creates a keen appetite.
But if Zadieyh cried himself to sleep that night, he was up bright and early next morning, had been amassed devoutly kneeling on the cold floor, blowing his fingers to keep them warm, and was home almost before the rest of the family were awake.
There was evidently some great matter of business on the young man's mind, for he scarcely ate his breakfast and left the table soon, eagerly cramming the remainder of his meal in his pockets.
Ma foi, but what now? Mused his mother, as she watched his little form sturdily trudging the track in the face of the wind. His head, with the rimless cap thrust close on the shock of black hair, bent low, his hands thrust deep in the bulging pockets.
A new live play toy, it may be, ventured the father. He is one funny child.
The next day, Zadieyh was late for school. It was something unusual, for he was always the first on hand to fix some plan of mechanism to make the teacher miserable. She looked reprovingly at him this morning when he came in during arithmetic class. His hair all wind-blown, his cheeks rosy from a hard fight with the sharp blast. But he made up for his tardiness by his extreme goodness all day. Just think, Zadieyh did not even eat once before noon, a something unparalleled in his entire previous history of his school life.
When the lunch hour came, and all the yard was a scene of feast and fun, one of the boys found him standing by a post, disconsolately watching a ham sandwich as it rapidly disappeared down the throat of a sturdy, square-headed little fella.
Hello, Edgar. What you got for lunch?
Nothing.
Ha! Why don't you stop eating in school for a change? You don't ever have nothing to eat.
I didn't eat today.
You did!
I tell you, I didn't. And Zadieyh's hard little fists planted a punctuation mark on his comrade's eye.
A fight in the schoolyard. Poor Zadieyh was in disgrace again. Still,
in spite of his battered appearance, a severe scolding from the principal, lines to write, and a further punishment from his mother, Tati scarcely remained for his dinner, but was off down the railroad track with his pockets partly stuffed with the remnants of a scanty meal.
And the next day, Tati was tardy again, and lunchless too. And the next, until the teacher, in despair, sent a nicely printed note to his mother about him, which might have done some good, had not Tati taken great pains to tear it up on the way home.
One day it rained, whole buckets full of water, that poured in torrents from a miserable, angry sky. Too wet a day for bits of boys to be trudging to school, so Tati's mother thought. So she kept him at home to watch the weather through the window, fretting and fuming like a regular storm in miniature. As the days wore on, and the rain did not abate, his mother kept a strong watch upon him, for he tried many times to slip away.
Dinner came and went, and the grey soddenness of the skies deepened into blackness of coming night. Someone called Tati to go to bed, and Tati was nowhere to be found.
Under the beds, in closets and corners, in such impossible places as the soap dishes and water pitcher even. They searched, but he had gone as completely as if he had been spirited away. It was of no use to call up the neighbors. He had never been near their houses, they affirmed. So there was nothing to do but to go to the railroad track where Tati had been seen so often, trudging in the shrill north wind.
With lanterns and sticks and his little yellow dog, the rescue party started down the track. The rain had ceased falling, but the wind blew a gale, scurrying great gray clouds over a fierce sky. It was not exactly dark, though in this part of the city there is neither gas nor electricity, and on such a night as this, neither moon nor stars dared show their faces in so gray a sky, but a sort of all-diffused lumosity was in the air, as though the sea of atmosphere was charged with an ethereal phosphorescence.
Search as they did, there were no signs of Tati. The soft earth between the railroad ties crumbled between their feet, without showing any small tracks or footprints.
We may as well return. He is not here.
Oh, mon Dieu, he is. He is, I know it.
So on they went, slipping on the wet earth, stumbling over the loose rocks, until a sudden wild yelp from Tiger brought them to a standstill. He had rushed ahead of them, and his voice could be heard in the distance, howling piteously.
With a fresh impetus, the little muddy party hurried forward. Tiger's yelps could be heard plainer and plainer, mingled now with a muffled, plaintive little wail.
After a while, they found a pitiful little heap of sodden rags lying at the foot of a mound of earth and stones thrown upon the side of the track. It was Tati, with a broken leg, all wet and miserable and moaning.
They picked him up tenderly and started to carry him home, but he cried and clung to the mother and begged not to go.
Oh, mon pauvre enfant, he has the fever.
No, it's my old man. He's hungry, sobbed Tati, holding out a little package. It was the remnants of his dinner, all wet and rain-washed.
What old man?
My old man. Oh, please don't go home till I see him. I'm not hurting much. I can go on.
Yielding to his whim, they carried him farther away, down the sides of the track, up to an embankment or levee by the sides of the Marigny Canal. Then, the big brother suddenly stopping, exclaimed,
Why, here's a cave. Is it Robinson Crusoe?
It's my old man's cave. Oh, please, go in. Maybe he's dead.
There cannot be much ceremony in entering a cave. There is but one thing to do. Walk in. This they did, and holding up the lantern, beheld a weird sight. On a bed of straw and paper in one corner laid a withered, wizened, white-bearded old man, with wide eyes staring at the unaccustomed light. In the other corner was an equally dilapidated cow.
No, it's my old man. He's hungry, sobbed Tati, holding out a little package. It was the remnants of his dinner, all wet and rain-washed.
So, the secret of Tati's jaunts down the railroad was out. In one of his trips around the swampland, he had discovered the old man exhausted from cold and hunger in the fields. Together they had found this cave, and Tati had gathered the straw and paper that made the bed. Then a tramp cow, old and turned adrift too, had crept in and shared the damp dwelling. And thither Tati had trudged twice a day, carrying his luncheon in the morning and his dinner in the afternoon.
There's a crown in heaven for that child, said the officer of charity to whom the case was referred.
But as for Tati, when the leg was well, he went his way as before.
There's a crown in heaven for that child who did what didn't need to be done, but felt. The same goes for those who act in the same manner when no one else is watching. What will it take for us to give this same service of love and compassion as this child who was hurt and still gave more than was never required? Hunger is digested when you're feeding someone else. Praise means nothing when it's leveled with helping others. Pain is nullified when you're someone's relief. What is sleep when you're someone else's rest? I hope before our time is up, we meet more people who eventually will hold on to a crown in heaven.
What does it take to be a human being? The ability to see, to hear, touch, taste, and smell, perhaps. Motion, be it transporting oneself or simply gesturing. Having wants and desires and always yearning for more. Having goals that may seem so far away, but when taken one step at a time are more often than not achievable. The ability to find happiness, of course, in other people and in the things around us, but more rarely found within ourselves. Thoughts, things not known by other people, and therefore an ability to keep secrets. Protecting the things we love and keeping them close. Fear, the fear of change and loss, the fear that one day things will not be the same, and that we will be in a worse environment, unable to return to the stability we once took for granted. Pain, or rather the torment of body and mind, and feeling the weight of the world come crashing down on us. Cruelty, taking that inner pain that we're experiencing and inflicting it onto others around us in hopes that we will find some sort of relief or distraction. Tears, being overcome with regret and a need to justify why things have happened a certain way, and wishing that we could have found some other path to go down. Acceptance, finding that understanding voice within ourselves to acknowledge the past and realize that everything has happened for a reason. Healing, finding the love in this world beginning from within and drawing it outward. Forgiveness to everyone who has hurt you, especially yourself, and eventually asking others for it. Completion, understanding that everything has purpose and that we can only do, feel, be, express, and understand what our imaginations allow us to. This is what it means to be a human being. Realizing that in every single person you walk by, regardless of the shape of their body, the hue of their skin, who they fall in love with, or how much money they can make, that behind their face is a living, breathing soul that is no more valuable than your own. Realizing that every person around you is an extension of yourself, no matter how different they may seem, and that hatred, in any form, limits what you can do. Realizing that to love is limitless. And wouldn't it be nice to live a limitless life? So, what does it mean to be a human being? People have come up with many different answers, but mine will always be love. Love.
He stood a moment on the steps of the bank, watching the human river that swirled down Broadway. Few noticed him, few ever noticed him, save in a way that stung. He was outside the world, nothing, as he said bitterly. Bits of the words of the walkers came to him.
The Comet?
The Comet.
Everybody was talking of it. Even the president, as he entered, smiled patronizingly at him and asked, "Well, Jim, are you scared?"
No, said the messenger shortly.
I thought we journeyed through the Comet's tail once, broke in the junior clerk affably.
Oh, that was Haley's. This is a new comet. Quite a stranger, they say. Wonderful, wonderful. I saw it last night. Oh, by the way, Jim, I want you to go down into the lower vaults today.
The messenger followed the president silently. Of course they wanted him to go down to the lower vaults. It was too dangerous for more valuable men. He smiled grimly and listened.
Everything of value has been moved out since the water began to seep in, but we missed 2 volumes of old records. Suppose you nose around down there? It isn't very pleasant, I suppose.
Not very, said the messenger as he walked out.
Well, Jim, the tail of the new comet hits us noon this time, said the vault clerk, as he passed over the keys. But the messenger passed silently down the stairs. Down he went beneath Broadway, where the dim light filtered through the feet of hurrying men, down to the dark basement beneath, down into the blackness and silence beneath that lowest cavern. Here, with his dark lantern, he groped in the bowels of the earth, under the world.
He drew a long breath as he threw back the last great iron door and stepped into the fetid slime within. Here at last was peace, and he groped moodily forward.
A great rat leaped past him, and cobwebs crept across his face. He felt carefully around the room, shelf by shelf, on the muddied floor, and in crevice and corner. Nothing.
Then he went back to the far end, where somehow the wall felt different. He sounded and pushed and pried. Nothing.
He started away. Then something brought him back. He was sounding and working again when suddenly the whole black wall swung as on mighty hinges, and blackness yawned beyond. He peered in. It was evidently a secret vault, some hiding place of the old bank, unknown in newer times.
A low, grinding, reverberating crash struck upon his ear. He started up and looked about. All was black and still. He groped for his light and swung it about him. Then he knew. The great stone door had swung to. He looked death squarely in the face. Then with a sigh he went methodically back to work. The cold sweat stood on his forehead, but he searched and pounded, pushed and worked until, after what seemed endless hours, his hand struck a cold bit of metal and the great door swung again harshly on its hinges, and then, striking against something soft and heavy, stopped. He had just room to squeeze through.
There lay the body of the vault clerk, cold and stiff. He stared at it and then felt sick and nauseated. The air seemed unaccountably foul, with a strong, peculiar odor. He stepped forward, clutched at the air, and fell fainting across the corpse.
He awoke with a sense of horror, leaped from the body and groped up the stairs, calling to the guard. The watchman sat as if asleep with the gate swinging free. With one glance at him, the messenger hurried up to the sub-vault. In vain he called to the guards. His voice echoed and re-echoed weirdly. Up into the great basement he rushed. Here another guard lay prostrate on his face, cold and still. A fear arose in the messenger's heart. He dashed up to the cellar floor, up into the bank. The stillness of death lay everywhere, and everywhere bowed, bent, and stretched the silent forms of men. The messenger paused and glanced about. He was not a man easily moved, but the sight was appalling.
Robbery and murder. He whispered slowly to himself as he saw the twisted, oozing mouth of the president where he laid half-buried on his desk. Then a new thought seized him. If they found him here, alone, with all this money and all these dead men, what would his life be worth? He glanced about, tiptoed cautiously to a side door, and again looked behind. Quietly, he turned the latch and stepped out into Wall Street.
How silent the street was. Not a soul was stirring, and yet it was high noon. Wall Street? Broadway? He glanced almost wildly up and down, then across the street, and as he looked, a sickening horror froze in his limbs. With a choking cry of utter fright, he lunged, leaned giddily against the cold building, and stared helplessly at the sight.
And the great stone doorway, 100 men and women and children lay crushed and twisted and jammed, forced into that great gaping doorway like refuse in a can, as if in one wild, frantic rush to safety, they had rushed and ground themselves to death. Slowly, the messenger crept along the walls, stilling the tremor in his limbs and the rising terror in his heart.
He met a businessman, now stone dead with wonder written on his lips.
A woman leaned warily against the signpost, her head bowed motionless on her lace and silken bosom.
A grimy newspaper boy sat in the gutter with the last edition in his uplifted hand.
"Danger!" screamed its black headlines.
Warnings wired around the world.
The comet's tail sweeps past us at noon.
Deadly gases expected.
Closed doors and windows.
Seek the cellar.
The messenger read and staggered on.
Far out from a window above, a girl lay with gasping face and sleevelets on her arms. On a store step sat a little, sweet-faced girl, looking upward towards the skies, and in the carriage by her lay... But the messenger looked no longer. The cords gave way, the terror burst in his veins, and with one great, gasping cry, he sprang desperately forward and ran as only the frightened run, shrieking and fighting the air until with one last wail of pain, he sank on the grass of Madison Square and lay prone and still.
When he rose, he gave no glance to the still and silent forms on the benches, but going to a fountain, bathed his face. Then, hiding himself in a corner away from the drama of death, he quietly gripped himself and thought the thing through. The comet had swept the earth, and this was the end. Was everybody dead? He must search and see. He knew that he must steady himself and keep calm, or he would go insane. First, he must go to a restaurant. He walked up Fifth Avenue to a famous hostelry and entered its gorgeous, ghost-hunted halls. He beat back the nausea and, seizing a tray from dead hands, hurried into the street and ate ravenously, hiding to keep out the sights. Yesterday, they would not have served me. He whispered as he forced the food down. Then he started up the street, looking, peering, telephoning, ringing alarms. Silent. Silent all. Was nobody? Nobody. He dared not think the thought and hurried on.
Suddenly he stopped still.
He had forgotten.
My God, how could he have forgotten?
He must rush to the subway. Then he almost laughed. No, a car if he could find a Ford.
He saw one. Gently he lifted its burden and took his place on the seat. He tested the throttle. There was gas. He glided off, shivering, and drove up the street.
As he was rushing past 72nd Street, he heard a sharp cry and saw a living form leaning wildly out an upper window. He gasped. The human voice sounded in his ears like the voice of God.
Hello? Hello, help in God's name! There's a dead girl in here and a man and see yonder dead men lying in the street and dead horses. For the love of God, go and bring the officers!
He wheeled the car in a sudden circle, running over the still body of a child and leaping on the curb. Then he rushed up the steps and tried the door and rang violently.
There was a long pause, but at last the heavy door swung back. They stared a moment in silence. She had not noticed before that he was a Negro.
He had not thought of her as white. She was a woman of perhaps 25, rarely beautiful and richly gowned, with darkly golden hair and jewels. Yesterday, he thought with bitterness, she would scarcely have looked at him twice. He would have been dirt beneath her silken feet.
She stared at him. Of all the sorts of men she had pictured as coming to her rescue, she had not dreamed of one like him. Not that he was not human, but he dwelt in a world so far from hers, so infinitely far, that he seldom even entered her thought. Yet, as she looked at him curiously, he seemed quite commonplace and usual. He was a tall, dark working man of the better class, with a sensitive face trained to stolidity and a poor man's clothes and hands. His face was soft and slow, and his manner at once cold and nervous, like fires long banked but not out.
So a moment each paused and gauged the other. Then the thought of the dead world without rushed in, and they started toward each other.
What has happened? Tell me. Nothing stirs. All is silence. I see the dead strewn before my window, as winnowed by the breath of God, and see... She dragged him through the great, silken hangings to where, beneath the sheen of mahogany and silver, a little French maid lay stretched in quiet, everlasting sleep, and near her a butler lay prone in his livery.
The tears streamed down the woman's cheeks, and she clung to his arm until the perfume of her breath swept his face, and he felt the tremors racing through her body.
I had been shut up in my darkroom developing pictures of the comet which I took last night, and when I came out, I saw the dead. What has happened?
Something. Comet or devils swept across the earth this morning, and many are dead.
Many? Very many?
I have searched, and I've seen no other living soul but you.
My father.
Where is he?
He started for the office.
Where is it?
In the Metropolitan Tower.
Leave a note for him here, and come.
Then he stopped.
No. First we must go to Harlem.
Harlem? Then she understood. She tapped her foot at first impatiently. She looked back and shuddered. Then she came resolutely down the steps.
There's a swifter car in the garage in the court.
I don't know how to drive it.
I do.
In 10 minutes they were flying to Harlem on the wind. He was gone but a moment. Then he returned, and his face was gray. She did not look, but said,
You have lost somebody?
I have lost everybody. Unless...
He ran back and was gone several minutes. Hours, they seemed to her.
Everybody. He said, and then he walked slowly back with something film-like in his hand, which he stuffed into his pocket. I'm afraid I was selfish.
But already the car was moving toward the park among the dark and lying dead of Harlem. The brown, still faces, the knotted hands, the homely garments, and the silence. The wild and haunting silence.
In and out among the dead they slipped and quivered, needing no sound of bell or horn until the great, square Metropolitan Tower hove in sight. Gently he laid the dead elevator boy aside. The car shot upward. The door of the office stood open. On the threshold lay the stenographer, and staring at her sat the dead clerk. The inner office was empty, but a note lay on the desk, folded and addressed, but unsent.
Dear daughter, I've gone for 100-mile spin in Fred's new Mercedes. Shall not be back before dinner. I'll bring Fred with me. JBH.
Come. We must search the city.
Up and down, over and across, back again. On went that ghostly search. Everywhere was silence and death, death and silence. He sniffed the air. An odor, a smell, and with the shifting breeze, a sickening stench filled their nostrils and brought its awful warning. The girl settled back helplessly in her seat.
What can we do?
It was his turn now to take the lead, and he did it quickly.
The long-distance telephone, the telegraph and the cable, night rockets, and then flight.
She looked at him now with strength and confidence. He did not look like men as she had always pictured men, but he acted like one, and she was content. In 15 minutes they were at the central telephone exchange. As they came to the door, he stepped quickly before her and pressed her gently back as he closed it. She heard him moving to and fro, and knew his burdens, the poor, little burdens he bore. When she entered, he was alone in the room. She seated herself on a stool and donned the bright earpiece. She turned her head and found herself alone. One moment she was terrified. Then she thanked him silently for his delicacy and turned resolutely. With a quick intaking of breath, "Hello?"
She called in low tones.
She was calling to the world.
The world must answer. Would the world answer? Was the world...
"Hello? Hello? Hello? Hello?"
What was that whirring? Surely, no. Was it the click of a receiver?
She bent close. She moved the pegs in the holes and called until her voice almost rose to a shriek, and her heart hammered. It was as if she had heard the last flicker of creation, and the evil was silence. Her voice dropped to a sob. She sat stupidly staring into the black and sarcastic mouthpiece, and the thought came again. Hope lay dead within her.
Yes, the cable and the rockets remained, but the world? She could not frame the thought or say the word. It was too mighty, too terrible. She turned toward the door with a new fear in her heart. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she was alone in the world with a stranger, with something more than a stranger, with a man alien in blood and culture, unknown, perhaps unknowable. It was awful. She must escape. She must fly. He must not see her again. Who knew what awful thoughts?
She gathered her silken skirts deftly about her young, smooth limbs, listened, and glided into a side hall. A moment she shrank back. The hall lay filled with dead women. Then she leapt to the door and tore at it with bleeding fingers until it swung wide. She looked out. He was standing at the top of the alley, silhouetted, tall and black, motionless. Was he looking at her or away? She did not know. She did not care. She simply leaped and ran until she found herself alone amid the dead and the tall ramparts of towering buildings.
She was alone. Alone. Alone on the streets, alone in the city, perhaps alone in the world. There crept in upon her the sense of deception, of creeping hands behind her back, of silent, moving things she could not see, of voices hushed in fearsome conspiracy. She looked behind and sideways, stared at strange sounds and heard still stranger, until every nerve within her stood sharp and quivering. Stretched to scream at the barest touch, she whirled and flew back, whimpering like a child, until she found that narrow alley again and the dark, silent figure silhouetted at the top. She stopped and rested. Then she walked silently toward him, looked at him timidly, but he said nothing as he handed her into the car. Her voice caught as she whispered, "Not that."
And he answered slowly, "No, not that."
They climbed into the car. She bent forward on the wheel and sobbed with great, dry, quivering sobs as they flew toward the cable office on the east side, leaving the world of wealth and prosperity for the world of poverty and work. In the world behind them were dead and silence, grave and grim, almost cynical, but always decent. Here it was hideous. It clothed itself in every ghastly form of terror, struggle, hate, and suffering. It lay wreathed in crime and squalor, greed and lust. Only in its dread and awful silence was it like to death everywhere.
Yet as the two, flying in alone, looked upon the horror of the world, slowly, gradually, the sense of an all-enveloping death deserted them. They seemed to move in a world silent and asleep, not dead. They moved in quiet reverence, lest somehow they wake these sleeping forms who had, at last, found peace. All nature slept until, and quick with the same startling thought, they looked into each other's eyes, he ashen and she crimson with unspoken thought. To both, the vision of a mighty beauty, of vast, unspoken things, swelled in their souls, but they put it away.
Great, dark coils of wire came up from the earth and down from the sun and entered this low lair of witchery. The gathered lightings of the world centered here, binding with beams of light the ends of the earth. The doors gaped on the gloom within. He paused on the threshold.
Do you know the code?
I know the call for help. We used it formerly at the bank.
She hardly heard. She heard the lapping of the waters far below, the dark and restless waters, the cold and luring waters, as they called. He stepped within. Slowly, she walked to the wall, where the water called below, and stood and waited. Long she waited, and he did not come. Then with a start she saw him, too, standing beside the black waters. Slowly he removed his coat and stood there silently. She walked quickly to him and laid her hand on his arm. He did not start or look. The waters lapped on in luring, deadly rhythm. He pointed down to the waters and said quietly,
The world lies beneath the waters now. May I go?
She looked into his stricken, tired face, and a great pity surged within her heart. She answered in a voice clear and calm. No.
Upward they turned toward life again, and he seized the wheel. The world was darkening to twilight, and a great gray pall was falling mercifully and gently on the sleeping dead. The ghastly glare of reality seemed replaced with the dream of some vast romance.
The girl lay silently back as the motor whizzed along. She forgot to wonder at the quickness with which he had learned to drive her car. It seemed natural. And then as they whirled and swung into Madison Square, and at the door of the Metropolitan Tower, she gave a low cry, and her eyes were great.
The man led her to the elevator of the tower, and deftly they ascended. In her father's office they gathered rugs and chairs, and he wrote a note and laid it on the desk. Then they ascended to the roof, and he made her comfortable. For a while she rested and sank to dreamy somnolence, watching the worlds above and wondering.
Below lay the dark shadows of the city, and afar was the shining of the sea. She glanced at him timidly as he set food before her and took a shawl and wound her in it, touching her reverently, yet tenderly. She looked up at him with thankfulness in her eyes, eating what he served. He watched the city. She watched him. He seemed very human, very near now.
Have you had to work hard?
Always.
I've always been idle. I was rich.
I was poor.
The rich and the poor met together.
The Lord is the maker of them all.
Yes. And how foolish our human distinctions seem now.
I was not human yesterday.
And your people were not my people. But today, he was a man no more. But he was in some larger sense a gentleman. Sensitive, kindly, chivalrous, everything save his hands and his face. Yet, yesterday...
Death. The leveler.
And the revealer.
He turned away, and after fumbling a moment, sent a rocket into the darkening air. It arose, shrieked, and flew up, a slim patch of light, and scattering its stars abroad, dropped on the city below. She scarcely noticed it. A vision of the world had risen before her.
Slowly, the mighty prophecy of her destiny overwhelmed her. Above the dead past hovered the angel of Annunciation.
She was no mere woman.
She was neither high nor low, white nor black, rich nor poor.
She was primal woman, mighty mother of all men to come and bride of life.
She looked upon the man beside her and forgot all else but his manhood, his strong, vigorous manhood, his sorrow and sacrifice.
She saw him glorified.
He was no longer a thing apart, a creature below, a strange outcast of another clime and blood, but her brother humanity incarnate, Son of God and great All-Father of the race to be.
He did not glimpse the glory in her eyes, but stood looking outward towards the sea and sending rocket after rocket into the unanswering darkness. Dark purple clouds lay banked and billowed in the west. Behind them and all around, the heavens glowed in dim, weird radiance that suffused the darkening world and made almost a minor music. Suddenly, as though gathered back in some vast hand, the great cloud curtain fell away. Low on the horizon lay a long, white star, mystic, wonderful, and from it fled upward to the pole, like some wan bridal veil, a pale white sheet of flame that lighted all the world and dimmed the stars.
In fascinated silence, the man gazed at the heavens and dropped his rockets to the floor.
Memories of memories stirred to life in the dead recesses of his mind.
The shackles seemed to rattle and fall from his soul.
Up from the crash, and crushing and cringing of his cast leaped the lone majesty of kings long dead.
He arose within the shadows, tall, straight, and stern, with power in his eyes and ghostly scepters hovering to his grasp.
It was as though some mighty pharaoh lived again, or curled Assyrian lord. He turned and looked upon the lady and found her gazing straight at him.
Silently, immovably, they saw each other face to face, eye to eye. Their souls lay naked to the night. It was not lust. It was not love. It was some vaster, mightier thing that needed neither touch of body nor thrill of soul. It was a thought divine, splendid.
Slowly, noiselessly, they moved toward each other. The heavens above, the seas around, the city grim and dead below. He loomed from out the velvet shadows, vast and dark. Pearl white and slender, she shone beneath the stars. She stretched her jeweled hands abroad. He lifted up his mighty arms, and they cried to each other, almost with one voice. The world is dead. Long live the...
Hoarse and sharp, the cry of a motor drifted clearly up from the silence below. They started backward with a cry and gazed upon each other with eyes that faltered and fell, with blood that boiled. Came the mad cry again, and almost from their feet a rocket blazed into the air and scattered its stars upon them.
She covered her eyes with her hands, and her shoulders heaved.
He dropped and bowed, groped blindly on his knees about the floor. A blue flame spluttered lazily after an age, and she heard the scream of an answering rocket as it flew.
Then they stood, still as death, looking to opposite ends of the earth.
The roar and ring of swift elevators shooting upward from below made the great tower tremble. A murmur and babble of voices swept in upon the night. All over the once dead city, the lights blinked, flickered, and flamed. And then, with a sudden clanging of doors, the entrance to the platform was filled with men. And one, with white and flying hair, rushed to the girl and lifted her to his breast.
My daughter!
Behind him hurried a younger, comelier man, carefully clad in motor costume, who bent above the girl with a passionate solicitude and gazed into her staring eyes until they narrowed and dropped, and her face flushed deeper and deeper crimson.
Julia, my darling, I thought you were gone forever.
Fred, is the world gone?
Only New York. But it is terrible, awful, you know. But you, how did you escape? How have you endured this horror? Are you well? Unharmed?
Unharmed.
And this man here?
Suddenly he stiffened and his hand flew to his hip.
Why? It's... Julia. Has he dared?
She lifted her head and looked at her late companion curiously, and then dropped her eyes with a sigh.
He has dared. All to rescue me. And I thank him much. But she did not look at him again.
As the couple turned away, the father drew a roll of bills from his pockets.
Here, my good fellow. Take that. What's your name?
Jim Davis.
Well, Jim, I thank you. I've always liked your people. If you ever want a job, call on me.
And they were gone. The crowd poured up and out of the elevators, talking and whispering.
Who was it?
Are they alive?
How many?
2.
Who was saved?
A white girl and a There she goes.
Where is he? Let's lynch the
Shut
damn...
up! He's all right. He saved her.
Saved? Hell, he had no business.
Here he comes.
Into the glare of the electric lights, the colored man moves slowly, with the eyes of those that walk and sleep.
Well, what do you think of that? Of all New York, just a white girl and a
The colored man heard nothing. He stood silently beneath the glare of the light, gazing at the money in his hand and shrinking as he gazed. Slowly, he put his other hand into his pocket and brought out a baby's filmy cap and gazed again. A woman mounted to the platform and looked about, shading her eyes. She was brown, small, and toil-worn, and in one arm lay the corpse of a dark baby. The crowd parted, and her eyes fell on the colored man. With a cry, she tottered towards him.
Jim!
He whirled, and with a sob of joy, caught her in his arms.
Was the world starting over? Were we Adam and Eve? Why us? I sat there staring at him. It was just him and me. 2 people together. An unexpected combination. I certainly never would have thought it up myself. We were so different, us 2. And yet, as I was sitting there, we weren't different at all. We had so much in common. Both alive and breathing, both scared. I knew he was scared, but it didn't seem like it. He was strong. I respected him. He respected me. I'd never really felt that before. Respect. I'm sure he hadn't either. And to think that if the rest of the world was awake, there would be none. I would walk right past him and look at the ground, as if he was barely human. How could I have thought that? How was that who I was? And yet, only a few hours later, here we were. Two human beings with respect between us. He made me feel beautiful. He made me feel seen. I'd never felt that before. It's amazing. He's amazing. He's my friend. Imagine us, friends. I can't help thinking about what I would have said a few hours ago. Would I even have really seen him? Would he just be a shadow I passed while I drove along and he walked to work? That scared me. The world was ending, yet that was the thought that scared me. I wanted to say I'm sorry, but what would that do? Sorry for what? For who? For all of us? For anyone who has ever treated him like that? Sorry wasn't enough. So I just sit here, and I stare at him in amazement. You're wonderful. Thank you. That's what I should say, but I won't. I don't have it in me. But I know he knows that I respect him. Let's start over. Clean slate. Thank you, I whisper. But he does not hear.
I'm tired. I'm so tired. I'm tired of fighting for basic human rights. I'm tired of waking up every day and seeing yet another face that's like mine on the news. I'm tired of the hashtags, the losses, all of it. I'm tired of not being treated the same as my peers simply because my skin color does not match theirs. I'm tired of not being seen as human and only receiving that recognition posthumously. I'm tired of living this life of inequality, knowing that only in death are things finally leveled. I mean, wouldn't you be? But yet I fight. I go on. I go on because the same way my ancestors struggled for us, we too must struggle for the generations that will follow. I push because I know that sooner rather than later, the doors that separate us from a life of equity and justice will no longer be able to resist our strength and will finally come crashing down. I hope, because I know even in the moments when all seems lost, hope is what never falters, and this hope is what has allowed us to fight for generations and generations. I live because I know that no matter how much society may try to reduce the significance of my life, I know my worth. I know that this life is worth living. Though I continue to feel tired, I remember that this fight isn't just mine. I remember that I am not alone. I remember that in the end, love will always prevail. So, I go on.
Looking back on a time of such hopelessness is a double-edged sword.
On the one hand, we can now rejoice in the fact that our world has become vastly different from the one that caused so much trauma.
But that trauma, that heartache, that frustration becomes a necessary yet painful thing to do.
As a generation, we have created a world where our children only know the pain of life's mundane unpleasantries.
But we knew. Very different.
Many look back on this fight as one of great sorrow.
This is unfortunately a fact nobody can deny.
But just as much as it was traumatizing, it was unifying, strengthening, and in many ways, beautiful.
We served as the echoes of those who came before us, and for the better world we knew was yet to come through our unified voices.
And in these outcries, these echoes, we found each other. We found support. We found ourselves. But most importantly, we found justice.
A renewed and genuine sense of what our country defines as justice for all.
And because of that, we still echo today.
We echo the voices of those who fought,
who sacrificed, and most importantly, those who we lost along the way.
And these echoes will ring out for generations to come, as we have finally broken away from the unknown and terrifying void that was holding us captive.